Welcome everyone to yet another edition of the Orthodox Nationalist. This is Matthew Raphael Johnson, and it's the 27th of July, 2022. Yesterday, I was on show Kiev and Rus, someone who I've worked with before, and he reminded me that it's the 27th anniversary of the so-called massacre in Srebrenica, Srebrenica, depending on who you ask, in 1995. I remember this distinctly, and I remember understanding, if very few people understand even today, that became the rallying cry for the constant, the so-called duty to protect doctrine. The idea that the empire can intervene anywhere in the world that it claims there's some terrible human rights abuse happening. Very rarely is that ever the case. Most of the time, it's something completely invented. Srebrenica many years ago is the first example of this. The global context was radically different than now. In 95, largely because of the condition of Russia at the time, that it had an occupation government, and the front man, the Joe Biden of the 90s, Boris Yeltsin. Many of you are aware that the U.S. bombed the Chinese embassy on purpose. There's no way that precision weapons can not be able to tell the difference from the radio tower to an embassy, especially since the embassy had its own radio beacon. It was done to show that things have changed, that the U.S. will stretch its military to the point of the breaking point. All the other interventions since then, Libya, the Congo, Syria, anywhere else, derive from this. And it seems that every intervention has to have a largely now make-believe massacre or something else terrible, based, of course, around Johnson's Law. This was one of the first times I began to formulate, it was really the Burmese situation, but I began to formulate the problem. The law that, because this is so obscure, people have no idea what's going on there, no matter what their last name might be. You have specialists in European politics who have no clue of what's going on there, let alone just the average educated person. They could invent whatever they want. When I say they, I mean the regime, NATO, corporations that were trying to get into Yugoslavia. I'm not going to get into the Yugoslav issue as far as the political theory behind the country. I understand why it happened. I also understand that while fairly successful economically in the 60s and 70s, by the late 80s it had fallen apart, largely due to debt and pressure from the West, especially Western banks. But that's not really the point. Breaking up Yugoslavia was essentially important, and as always, the Muslims were the American clients. This has been the case everywhere, from Thailand to Burma to China to Syria to Macedonia to Bosnia itself. The U.S. financed, in Chechnya, I should mention, the U.S. financed Islamic rebels from day one. Now, I've been debating this topic for years, and no one really actually knows. They've just heard this. They really believe that the International Criminal Tribunal, the former Yugoslavia, the ICTY, is a court. It's not. It's very much like the Nuremberg trials. It was U.S. Army, etc., NATO, created this. It was never a court. It's not. It doesn't have normal legal procedures. Hearsay is perfectly legitimate, and because they have some authority, they're considered a court. At least it's reported that way. People think, oh, this is done. They've been convicted, whatever, not knowing any idea who they is. But at the time, you couldn't talk about the Serbs in public. I did, and of course I had to pay for it. That's how complete the propaganda was. To a great extent, this was a test case. How can the American media demonize a group of people, a political movement, whatever, to the point where they can justify bombing them? And of course, the U.S. population had no idea. This is 95, remember? The web wasn't out yet, really. And there was very little, actually there was no alternative information unless, you had contact within the Serbian and Russian population, which of course I did at the time. And so I was saying things that people didn't know, and therefore it must be false. They come across something they don't understand, and they're hostile to it. They didn't know what a Serb was. But since they've heard it, assume that this is an actual court, it must be true. And it never went any farther than that. These are university professors I'm talking about here. Now, the founding documents of the ICTY are inherently anti-Serbian. If you read the foundation, the documents that created this so-called court, or this tribunal, it talks about purging and cleansing Serbia of nationalists, of keeping Yugoslavia from ever forming again, controlling Serb nationalism, no other forms, just Serbian nationalism, and silencing the Radical Party, etc. That's what the founding documents of the International Criminal Tribunal of the former Yugoslavia say. Again, you can't get any more obscure than this, but university professors who specialize in comparative politics have no excuse. If the New York Times says it, it must be true. What it comes down to, this so-called massacre, was the invention of numerous political forces. Bosnian Muslims who were very wealthy, especially in the diaspora. The Albanians who were working with Ruder Finn, which was a huge PR firm in New York City, usually with drug money. That's all the Albanian economy is. That and prostitution. The New York Times, NATO, the U.S. military in particular, the Italians and Croatians. The Croatians were far less powerful than the Muslims were. They didn't like each other anyway. Created a myth, and that myth was that the Serbs in a war in this part of Bosnia slaughtered something, the official number is 8,372 victims executed by the regular forces of the Republika Srpska, or the Serbian Republic, the very nationalist Serbian political group created by the fear of destruction. It's a partition, an ethnic partition. And for no reason they murdered these POWs. And that became the reason for the U.S. intervention. Not a shred of that is true. No evidence has ever been granted, ever been given, ever been cross-examined, has ever been unearthed that buttress any of those claims. Now, I've gone to, I think, the best source here today. Of course, at the time we didn't have this. But the best source today is the Srebrenica project, which is in Novi Sad. It's in a few other cities. And they have an excellent series of, about 20 books worth of stuff, including all the forsenics, including all of the autopsies of what could be recovered from this Serbian region. Remember, this was a Serb area that had been overtaken by Bosnian Muslim forces. Bosnian Muslim forces that were financed and armed by the U.S. Now, what no one mentions is that from 1992 to 1995, the Bosnian Muslims had completely, and I mean completely, cleansed that area, that part of Bosnia of Serbs. It's roughly 120 villages, all of which have the names registered, how you were either murdered or simply driven out of the area. And it became the base of operations for both the regular and irregular Bosnian Muslim army in the area. Now, the press at the time, I remember this very well, the press at the time said this was a demilitarized zone and a protected zone, protected by a small Dutch UN force. Now, by the way, that small Dutch UN force says that nothing terrible happened here, at least as far as the Serbs are concerned. The Serbs did not kill anybody. That wasn't a matter of combat operations. Of course, that wasn't true. Nothing was true that these people claimed. The New York Times was a big culprit here. They just got their information from the Pentagon and Reuter Finn and Amnesty and your typical NGO list and, CIA, State Department. That's what they considered legitimate source for a journalist. No, the U.S. had made sure that the region around Srebrenica was quite militarized. American helicopters were dropping weapons and supplies into the Muslims. It was, however, an exclave. It was. This is a Serbian area, generally speaking, and having taken it, the main Muslim force had pulled out, leaving both regulars and irregulars leaderless by 1995. These enclaves were agreed both by Milosevic and Izetbegovic in Bosnia. Again, an American client who agreed to get rid of these because these they cost a lot of money to defend, and they were small exclaves within an enemy territory. The only possibility, of course, was to create ethnic separatism, which is usually the solution to many problems. The only group that was not allowed to do that, of course, were the Serbs. The problem now with the number of victims. There's no evidence that any of these people were Muslims. That were Muslim POWs, that weren't Muslim regulars, and that weren't part of combat operations. Because they were killed, they were therefore killed illegitimately. So the official number is 8372, but really no one holds to that. Official sources start with, in the Bosnian Atlas of Crime, about 4,256 killed, including in combat and everything else. Now, the ICTY judgment says between 7,000 and 8,000 people. But the same tribunal, and that was in the trial of Radoslav Kristic. Of course, he was convicted before he ever started. This is the Serbian Colonel Popovic. The exact same event, they said something like several thousand. Then they said 5,336 killed by execution, despite there being no evidence for execution. And a third judgment from General Tulimir in Serbia and Bosnia. The number of victims was 4,970. In other words, the same tribunal, trying different people, have completely different numbers for allegedly those that were killed in Srebrenica. And here's the key issue. It's not just because they constantly vary, because they really draw numbers out of nothing. There were legitimate executions there, and these were Muslims who had helped kill or drive out the native Serbs of that part of the area, that at least 150 small villages. So they blur those. It might be about 450 were legitimately executed and had every right to be executed. But they don't make a distinction between those who were executed for crimes versus those who died of suicide, the infighting amongst Muslim factions, regulars and irregulars, those who are still missing and no one knows where they are, and of course, most importantly, those who were killed in combat. The Serbs and Muslims fought ferociously for the previous 3 years. They never make the distinction between combat deaths. And now, if today, the problem is, you go to the New York Times, Washington Post, they're going to tell you, oh, it's 8,000. It's kind of like the 6 million figure. It's become a sacred number. It's become the go-to number everyone assumes is exactly true. And woe betide you if you reject it. There was an attempt in Northern Europe and in Canada to pass Srebrenica genocide denial laws. That's how important this make-believe massacre was to the regime. During these so-called trials, none of these were trials by any normal sense Because of the nature of this tribunal, it was meant to destroy the Serbs in the area. That was its purpose. So these weren't trials. These were Stalinist in every sense of the term. Of course, a tiny handful were executed for legitimate reasons. Everyone else died in combat. That's the truth of the matter. They have one witness. It was there's a book actually by a Bulgarian journalist called Star Witness about this guy. He is a Bosnian Croat. His name is Dražen Idamovic. He is the sole witness that all of these so-called convictions needed. He claimed to be, now we gotta be careful here. This was their man. He was a member of the 10th Sabotage Unit within the Bosnian Serb Army. Now, he was convicted in 1998 for the killings of several hundred Bosnian Muslim and their claim to be male civilians. No one's ever said how many there are, which of course is ridiculous. He cut a deal. Now, chances are none of this is true. We'll talk about this in a minute. But he made a deal with the prosecutor. Now, his testimony was always changing, but in exchange for damning testimony, he was set free after a very short time, given an income and protected status, essentially witness protection. The only condition is that he has to testify against Serbs whenever he's called on. Now, this man fully admitted, and this comes straight from the Srebrenica project, he fought on all three sides of the Bosnian conflict, the Croats, the Muslims, and the Serbs. Before he first testified, he was given a psychiatric exam which he failed. On June 27, 1996, he was considered unfit for further trial and was mentally impaired. Now, just a few days later, he was there still testifying against Radovan Karadzic, commander of the Bosnian Serb army, Mladic, both of them. Despite him being unfit to be questioned, everything he said was unverified and unchallengeable. It didn't matter. That was the grounds on which Mladic and Karadzic were arrested and convicted. The U.S. specifically called for this guy when he was first arrested. His testimony was laughable. I mentioned the Bulgarian book, in German, Chivikov. He doesn't know. First of all, he's changed his testimony a million times, but he can't tell you the exact location where any of this took place. He says 1,200 prisoners were executed for no reason by the Bosnian Serb forces, but the place where he says it happened, the remains only of about 100 people were ever dug up. 70 of them did have blindfolds and ligatures, which was legitimate. That's death by execution, in this case for very, very good reason. Despite how absurd that is, it didn't stop him from continuing to testify. He also couldn't tell you the exact date of this massacre. You couldn't even tell you he didn't even tell you what rank he was. He went from sergeant to private to lieutenant colonel every time he testified. And worse, he cannot tell you who gave the order for any of this to happen. The most he ever said, and I'm quoting directly here, in his version it was some lieutenant colonel who still has not been identified after almost 20. Well, in this case, when this was written over 20 years, now it's 27. Despite all of that, everyone who he testified against, to some extent or another, was convicted based entirely entirely on this man's constantly changing testimony. Not only has all of this been accepted without any cross-examination, but that anybody who could explain and testify otherwise was never permitted to testify at the so-called trial. Now, the 10th Sabotage Detachment, in my personal opinion, never existed. That sounds like, it's like ISIS. It sounds like a media-created term to make them sound clandestine and violent. He says, however, that It's a multi-ethnic group, multi-religious group. There was no chain of command connected to the Bosnian Serb army or anyone else for that matter. And on top of it all, he was forced to admit that they were on a 10-day leave at the time this happened. If there is a 10th sabotage detachment, it has nothing to do with any regular force. It's largely a creation either of the tribunal or of the media at the time. Now, it keeps getting worse here. And this is something we all need to take very seriously. Every single person, I think it's about a half dozen, from 2003 to 2010, who was convicted by this kangaroo tribunal, none of them ever were directly accused of killing anybody, nor were they accused of giving any orders to kill anybody. Now, I want to quote this from the project directly here, so there's no misunderstanding. They give a list of these guys, and it says, none of the above individuals was ever accused or convicted of executing war prisoners, but convicted only on the basis of command responsibility within the controversial joint criminal enterprise doctrine developed just by this tribunal, which, of course, you don't need evidence to convict anybody. This is a more extreme version of the American RICO statute. So you can convict anybody. You can convict me of this. You can convict anyone. So there's people who went to prison, sometimes for life, were never tied to anything that happened, good, bad, or indifferent at the time. It didn't matter. Like the RICO statute in America, if you are deemed to be a part of an ongoing criminal organization, everyone in that organization can be convicted. For better or for worse, of course, that's only used against the Italian mafia, no one else. But that's pretty much the more extreme version of this doctrine here. But remember, it's not a legal doctrine anywhere. It was created at the time solely to put Serbs away. The Srebrenica project lays out every conceivable form of that. This area has been so substantially excavated. And to this day, no one is sure of anything. Because these so-called tribunals relied on one person. No cross-examination was permitted, at least none that was substantial. And I want to stress here, no one, after 20 years of this, 20 years of these phony trials, no one has ever established who gave the orders for any of these events, whether it be legitimate combat or execution. If they find a body, what they end up doing is, this was a relatively small area. Because they didn't get the sacred 8,000 figure, they had to now dig anywhere. Within 100 square miles. It didn't matter where they were. If you died anywhere within 50 square miles of that place, you were executed by Bosnian Serbs. They're still doing it. There's people buried in the official cemetery who died of old age. There's people who couldn't be identified at all that are assumed to have been not killed in combat, not died of some other cause, not just locals, but murdered by Bosnian Serbs for no reason. Now, why was Srebrenica so important? Izetbegovic, who was a leader of the Bosnian, the so-called president, Izetbegovic, was told, and there are several witnesses to this, that NATO intervention in Bosnia would occur if only the Serbs would break into Srebrenica and kill at least 5,000 people. They need a vaguely credible story of a Serbian victory, the Serbs are victorious, and that they start slaughtering people for no reason. There are 9 witnesses to this comment. He denies it, of course. This was communicated to him by Bill Clinton himself. One of the Muslim wartime leaders, Ibran Mustafic, the whole bunch of Muslims around Izetbegovic said that this was given to him. They had to create a slaughter to justify American intervention. You didn't need any evidence. You just needed enough people to say this happened, especially media people. See, the ICTY was created in 1992. It was created precisely to give a certain official justification to their invention. Now, there's the official cemetery there, under the control of the U.S. State Department. The memorial, the labs that allegedly go over exhumed bodies, they're still going on. It's the Takari Memorial Center. Again, financed entirely by NATO and the U.S. Also involved with the ICMP, or the International Commission on Missing Persons. Also, totally a U.S. government agency. They alone have access to evidence and bodies. The truth of the matter is, the closest that anyone can estimate, and even you have about 3,000 combat deaths there, roughly in mid-July of 1995. And Bosnians are not, these are official doctrines. The director of the Information and Documentation Center in Sarajevo said that about 500 living residents of Srebrenica that was classified as missing years ago have been found. 70 people at this cemetery who were not killed anywhere near Srebrenica. Ibran Mustafic, who was a Bosnian Muslim, a civilian from the area, stated that about 1,000 people were killed in internecine battles, that is to say, amongst Muslims, as they withdrew from the area in July of 1995. There is one person who will tell you in great detail about the slaughter of Serbs in that 3-year period of 92 to 95. That's Nasser Oric. Despite the fact that he was Washington's man, commander of the Muslim forces in the area, he's published the names of 1,333 men from the allegedly demilitarized Srebrenica enclave that were killed in battle prior to the fall of the town in July of 95. But it was Oric, again, Washington's Muslim commander there. He was the one, over that 3-year period, launched the absolutely brutal and murderous raids on surrounding Serb villages. Never even talked about, let alone classified as genocide. The only mark that anyone had to have to be destroyed was Serbian Orthodox background. There's even several people there, the Memorial Center, that will tell you that, well, they're closely related to people who were killed in battle, therefore we're also going to count them as killed. You have both Muslims and Serbs who are screaming and yelling about how manipulative this all is. How you have anyone who died in that area is considered a victim. And you have actual Serb victims who aren't allowed anywhere near here. But the project also mentions a few other things. The highest ranking, and I've mentioned this before, the highest ranking UN official in Bosnia at the time said that between 700 and 800 people were executed in the vicinity of Srebrenica at the time. In other words, these are people who committed war crimes. These are some of Oric's men. These were panicked, struggling soldiers fighting for their homeland. How dare these people in positions of comfort, in tenured academic positions, dare judge how these men are to react? These guys were from there. They were fighting for families. They were fighting to possibly save whatever Serbs were left in that area from people like Oric. And these people living in comfort, living in big cities, never held a rifle in their lives, are going to dictate how they're supposed to behave. But even someone like Yusuf Bodnansky, who was a director of the Congressional Task Force on Terrorism and Unconventional Warfare in the U.S. House, and he held that position from 88 to 04, he was extremely angry at the media manipulation. He said 7,000 so-called victims is disinformation. And he said, and I'm quoting him directly here, all independent forensic evidence points to Muslim casualties in the hundreds, possibly the low hundreds. Continued emphasis on such allegedly high numbers of Muslim deaths at Srebrenica also obfuscates the Muslim murders in that city earlier of Serb civilians. So we have a few issues so far. Number one, you have an ongoing war in this area where you have, bodies being exhumed with all kinds of uniforms. Number two, you had irregular forces that did not wear uniforms, which is an issue I've come back to again and again. Those would be considered criminals, not military men. If you don't wear a uniform and have no clear chain of command, you're not an army. You're a criminal group. And therefore what happens to you has nothing to do with international law at all. This is what happens when you get involved in a war you have no right to get involved in. The Muslims were, again, from the Americans, from the CIA, from military intelligence, from NATO, were organizing, just like in Ukraine today, militia forces, irregular forces. Because of that, you don't have any civilians. The concept of civilian is irrelevant. There were no civilians there at the time anyway. So when they use the word civilian, they don't know what they're talking about. Now, one of the experts used at this, the Stalinist trials here, Richard Butler, it was his name, in warfare, he states that about 2,000 Bosnian Muslim fighters were killed in that period of time. These are combat deaths here. And these are regulars, so to speak. They were irregulars too, but they're very hard to identify. If they're in civilian clothes, no one says, well, they might have been irregular forces. They're considered automatically to be victims. Anyone who has that's the next thing. Anyone who dies in an area is considered. They keep expanding the radius of where they're digging because they just need more and more bodies. But there were people, even at the National Security Agency, John Schindler was his name, who's an analyst there. His estimate was 5,000 Bosnian Muslims killed in combat. Carl Bildt, the high official, the EU envoy, also the UN envoy, says about 4,000. And he writes that in his memoirs. The UN officially puts the number of combat Muslim deaths at about 3,000. Well, that's roughly about how many people have been found in the area. And of course, they uncover Serbs. They just simply say that they're Muslims. Again, all of this is, and this is the next issue too I have to mention, number 4 or 5, whatever we're on. This is all being done under U.S. State Department control. There are no alternative investigations permitted. You can't look at the bodies. You can't do anything like that. Now, at the time, you had Spanish, Portuguese especially, and Dutch forces I mentioned already. This is the next thing. All saying that this was an unfortunate combat situation, and under no circumstances was this ever a demilitarized zone. I remember at the time, the headlines saying Serbs slaughter civilians in demilitarized zone. Now, that was never the case, thanks to the Americans. Because the U.S. is responsible for this war, is responsible for stoking these ethnic tensions, because they armed only one side, and because Russia, of course, was prostrate at the time, the U.S. now has to cover over itself. Bosnian Serbs, they have names like Mladic. They sound like James Bond bad guys. These aren't accidental. Just like ISIS, just like all of these, but of course, Oric is never mentioned. We'll talk more about him in just a second. Now, I'm going to go again. This all comes from the project. All this stuff, it's in numerous languages, and when they have forcenics and autopsies of every single body here, this is very easy to explain. And we talked about the official number being 8,000. When I say official, I mean this is the regime's number. No one else holds to that number, but the New York Times, I think, was the first one to mention it, and then it was repeated by the so-called court system. It really wasn't that long ago, maybe 10 years ago. From 1995 to 2001, that's when it was under the tribunal's control. Then it became under the State Department's control, even to this day. They found and they use the word case, 3,568 cases. But these could be a fingernail, these could be a bone, these could be anything. In fact, 44% of these cases were a piece of something, just a bone or whatever. Here's all they have, and let me go through this list here. This is official now. Remember, these guys are all still in jail, but this is the official. Indisputable execution victims. The number is 442. When I say indisputable, I mean that they have blindfolds on. These are the men, usually irregulars, who were involved in the cleansing of the Serb villages over the previous 3 years. Put yourself in their position, I'd be executing them too. Now, 627, now I'm citing from official sources here, 627 were clearly combat deaths because they had shrapnel or any kind of fragment. Points to death in combat, obviously. 505 have direct bullet injuries, but not execution bullets. 411, they had no clue. No, you can't simply tell. When you have a bone or when you have a fingernail, you can't tell what these people died from. Death could not, this is from the ICTY itself. They concluded the cause of death could not be determined for 92.4% of what they found. But even when they try to match body parts and trying to use DNA on the rest of it, the total number of bodies they can account for is under 2,000. Almost all of them either unknown or combat deaths. As I said, only about 442, which actually was the Serbian estimate at the time, but with very good reason. Chances are these are Orj's men. But at least since 2000, remember this is 95, since 2002, the exhumations, identifications, analysis, forensics, this comes under, as I mentioned, the International Commission on Missing Persons, which is directly under the State Department. So you can't, no one from the general public, no matter how well educated, is permitted to work there without a direct permit and under strict control from these people. So just by just a few of those points, every conviction is laughable. No one can be convicted with zero evidence. And as I mentioned before, essentially they've taken every casualty of the 28th Division of the Bosnian Muslim Army against the Serb forces as a victim of execution. Again, Johnson's Law. What does Johnson's Law say? The more obscure the area, the more that the media and the regime can make up stuff about it. There's just so few people who can contradict them. Why even do your research? Just start inventing the most exciting black hat, white hat, moral fighting and battle. Do that. The James Bond dictators and that kind of thing, world domination. Just use that kind of language because this is what people respond to in an era where no one's reading newspapers anymore. It seems that every year they keep expanding the radius of where they're digging. And to this day, they're nowhere close to the 8,000 that these people were. At least one person, Krisic, was put away for life for. Essentially, they treat this region as a repository of so-called genocide victims. If you're 90 years old, you die of natural causes in 1989 in this area, they're going to dig up your coffin and say, this is a victim. Still, to this day, 8,000 is nothing but for 8,000 POWs. My God, there weren't this many guys fighting in the area on both sides combined. It's a 6 million type figure. I've come under withering attack when I was teaching of challenging and making fun of this 8,000 number. There is a sacredness to it. The New York Times says it, and this wholly objective court says it, therefore you're crazy. So, well, the court says many things. They don't even have their numbers right. Even the court itself, every case is a different number. And this lunatic, who they rely on for their testimony, really one person. Not Bookstar Witness. I don't know. I think it's in English. I don't know. I've only read reviews of it. I don't think it's in English. I might be wrong on that. Someone has to check for me. Not a whole lot of Bulgarian stuff. It was actually written in German. I shouldn't say that. It was written for Deutsche Welle. But I don't know if it's in English. I don't think it is. I really haven't been able to find it. But it doesn't matter because a project has found it. And they write on it extensively and take a lot of information for him. So despite the fact that from pretty much the commission of this battle to the present day, the region around Srebrenica has been under first the control of after the U.S. intervention. They got the 8,000 that they need, in at least in rhetoric, and so they launched the invasion. This is what Izetbegovic needed. This is what he was told to produce. Some people deny it. Some people were there saying it absolutely did happen. This is what they needed. They needed this number. They needed something. I think it was 5,000 at the time. And of course, the real issue was, are the Serbs going to win this? And of course, the answer is yes. Srebrenica is a Serbian area, as the name suggests. The word Serbia is like the word Argentina. It's the land of silver, and that's what Srebrenica means. When I remember this happened, and I was teaching myself some Serbian at the time, I said, wait a minute. I don't think it's an accident that this is the city. This is a central, or was, a central silver-producing region. Silver is one of the things that built the Serbian Empire in the Middle Ages. That's what the word Serbia means. Again, like Argentina in the West. Same kind of, it's a country named after silver. And because of what the word Srebrenica means, it's such a core aspect of Serbian identity that this is why it was there that they picked the very heart of the Serbian mind and the building of the Serbian Empire in the Middle Ages, which was one of the largest and most powerful, even more than the Byzantine Empire at certain times under Dusan, etc. Some of you know, by the way, that I have a book on this topic. I've only written one book on Serbia, Heavenly Serbia and the Medieval Idea. This is years and years and years ago. It's under Ramada Press. It's under Diapara Press that you can search for. And I deal not so much with these killing. I think I mentioned in the introduction. But it's mostly medieval and modern work in terms of history. It's mostly an understanding of the medieval, the medieval idea. It was an answer to From Myth to Genocide, which was that awful book, which came out right around this time, not coincidentally, that demonized everything Serbian. Angelovic, I can't think. I think it's a Croat who wrote it. New York University Press. It's a disaster. This book came out at the same time this was going on to condemn everything. It's ridiculous. There's no foundation for a lot of his claims. And that became the academic source that you had to read. And I was in grad school at the time. And that's why I wrote this book. It's kind of an answer to it. And I've found some first-hand documents or primary source documents that very few people even know exists. So please get your hands on that if you can. So summarizing to this point, which is kind of hard to do. There's so much happening here. And let's just recount again the purpose for this. The so-called New World Order after the Cold War ended needed a justification for the notion of being able to intervene anywhere in the world militarily. This is prior to China becoming, it was a first world country, but it was still growing militarily. Russia was on its back. It was considered that the 70s version of Soviet communism was discredited, and the end of history was here. Well, if the end of history is here, then the agents of the end of history, that is to say NATO or the U.S. military, thus has the right, for that reason alone, to intervene anywhere in the world. I remember the Russian, when I was at the Russian Imperial Union order at the time, I remember so many people saying, this is the test case. No one else was saying that. From them, I began to say it. Srebrenica is the sacred core of the post-Cold War New World Order doctrine in terms of military intervention. Every intervention since then has had its own Srebrenica. And we've talked about a lot. In fact, I think we've talked about all of them at one time or another on the Orthodox Nationalist or the Daily Nationalist for mine on Thursday, and the thousands of other shows I've been on. And To be honest with you, I was going to forget this 27th anniversary. I forgot the 25th anniversary. Now, if you go back to 2011, I did an hour-long show. I think that was the Voice of Reason days, that I did when they arrested Mladic, I think. That was front page news. I did sort of an emergency show. I sat down at the computer and I went just within minutes of hearing about that, because I knew what this meant. I knew what this meant even in 2011, though this was long after that. This is what I knew the problem was in terms of intervention. And arresting this guy, you knew this man didn't have a chance. When Milosevic was put on trial, he didn't have a chance. No, I read through the transcripts without fail from all of this. And you can't call any of these, whether it be Milosevic or anyone else, a court in any normal sense of the term. The way that normal criminal courts operate, they're essentially de facto courts. They're founded for the sake of putting certain people away. That's why the ICTY was created, with, of course, NATO money. They didn't make any bones about being non-objective. I'll repeat it again. Their purpose was to condemn and destroy Serbia. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the genocide of Serbs from 92 to 95 in around the Srebrenica area. Now, there is a study out called The Serbian Victims of Srebrenica, 92 to 95, and it was done in the Netherlands. The Srebrenica Historical Project, which I'm citing from here, is from the Netherlands, too. There's several. The Srebrenica Project, Historical Project, there's a bunch of these. It's a Dutch-based NGO. So this is an international matter. This isn't just Serbs. Not that that would be a problem, but this is an international. And the Netherlands always has been, because their forces under the UN were the first to say nothing really bad happened here, except other than combat. And they were there. Of course, they weren't called to testify or anything. The Dutch have always been very suspicious of the Srebrenica claim. Now, this NGO states the estimate of 705 Serbian civilians, non-combatants in every sense of that term, were murdered on this territory at that time. The number is not final. This place has been dug up so much, I don't even know how you can live there. Now, there's another institute, this is cited by the project too, the Institute for Research of Serbian suffering in the 20th century. When you consider this would be the third time there was an attempt to wipe the Serbs off the map. This is during the Balkan Wars and after the Balkan Wars in the camps of the Hungarians. Then, of course, World War II, from numerous sides. And then, of course, these genocidal operations. In many ways, just like the Holocaust, to some extent, was used to cover over Soviet atrocities, this is to cover over American, Muslim, and Croat atrocities at the time. Operation Storm was where the Croatian army, armed, trained, led by U.S. Army forces and military intelligence, cleansed most of Croatia of Serbs. Remember, this is where the term ethnic cleansing was first coined, Srebrenica. It was a media term. It's a Rudolf Finn term. Now, they've published a list, and these are names and addresses, over 3,200 Serbian victims. Now, these aren't necessarily killings. These are woundings. These are exiles, people simply driven from the area. And I mentioned already the commander of the Muslim forces in Srebrenica, Nasser Oric. And this includes places like Srebrenica, Osmaci, Vlasenica, Milisi. So this is not a small area, but Srebrenica is the core area here. I want to talk about Nasser Oric. There was a 1995 July 16th, so this is prior to the Srebrenica claims, written by Bill Schiller. It came from the Toronto Star. And the article is called "Fearsome Muslim Warlord Eludes Bosnian Serb Forces." Now, this is a newspaper, part of the regime. And It's an interview and a discussion with Oric himself. This is a man who actually did, and by his own admission, cleanse Serbs from this very same area just a couple of years before the battle that created all this mythology. And I'm quoting him here. His crimes are on a video cassette tape. Burned Serb houses and headless Serb men, their bodies crumpled in a pathetic heap. We had to use cold weapons that night, Oric explains. He shows scenes of dead men sliced by knives roll over on his 21-inch Sony. And he's showing him killing somebody. So this is the house of a Serb named Ratzo. The camera goes to him. He killed 2 of my men, so we torched it. Tough luck. Reclining on an overstuffed couch, clothed head and toe in camouflage fatigues, a U.S. Army patch proudly displayed over his heart. Oric gives the impression of a lion in his den. Claimed to be the toughest guy in town. This was the so-called safe zone. And another one, weapons, cash, and chaos lend clout to Srebrenica's tough guy. That's John Pomfret. That's the Washington Post in February of 94. Oric, as bloodthirsty a warrior as could ever cross the battlefield, escaped Srebrenica before it fell. Some believe he may be leading the Bosnian Muslim forces in the nearby enclaves of Zipa and Gorađe. Last night, these forces seized armored personnel carriers and other weapons from the UN peacekeepers in order to better protect themselves. And he was met in 94 in his own house, and his house was in Srebrenica at the time. And he goes on to talk about his war crimes. He says it on screen, he has it on video, and he's showing these journalists things that he did. He shows a bullet-marked ghost town, one of the villages that they cleansed. He says, we killed 114 Serbs there. He even had choirs singing his praises at the time. There was no question that this is a war criminal. This is a man who was lauded as a war criminal by 2 newspapers, Toronto and the Post. He talks about cleanse. When I talk about these villages that I mentioned being cleansed from head to toe, this man is explaining it in depth. He had to have known there's a lot of drug money with guys like this. A lot of drug money from Albania, from the Muslims there, from the pipeline prior to the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, parts of the Bekaa Valley, all the rest of it coming into through Albania and Kosovo, up until Bosnia, among many other places. This is where this money comes from. Wearing the U.S. Army patch over his heart, that means this man was considered a adjunct to the American forces, which didn't do the fighting there, but they did the leading and they did the training there. It's really hard to believe he's talking about committing war crimes. He's talking about wiping villages out. And he says he killed a few of my men. Well, maybe for very good reason. He doesn't say one way or the other. I shouldn't have to tell you that, of course, he has never been brought on trial. He's never been, despite admitting this and screaming about it, because he's an American Army adjunct, he gets away with it. Because, of course, guys like this are involved in the drug trade, he gets away with it. U.S. Army, and from Camp Bond-Steel, which I don't think existed at the time, this is 94, the U.S. has been greasing the skids for the heroin trade coming out of Afghanistan. Of course, that spigot has been turned off because the Taliban and the Taliban's, and this is not just Taliban, this is also Iran and many other places, have fatwa, I don't know what the plural is, fatwas, against the drug trade, not to mention nuclear weapons. In fact, the Iranian government has condemned nuclear weapons. Too many innocents could be killed. No one has bothered to notice that. So now that spigot has been turned off. But the journalist in the Toronto Star went so far as to say, yeah, he's showing him personally committing war crimes. And the journalist, Bill Schiller, actually calls it Nasir Oric's greatest hits. Hits in the sense of a mafia hit. He's trying to be funny about these kind of things. You can't get a more direct witness here. Never has this guy even been mentioned outside of a handful of articles like this. No one knows who he is. And if you challenge somebody with this kind of thing, what are they going to do? It isn't so much that they claim to be knowledgeable, but they claim to believe it. And therefore, you're in a lot of trouble. They're not going to accept it. They can't learn anything. You're just going to have to just throw a few things out there and just get out of there. It's not worth it. These myths, and I use myths in a very technical sense. This is the background information for their whole agenda. Republicans, Democrats, all were screaming about this. Because what they'll do, and I said this before, also tested out in the Yugoslav case. They went to the left and said Milosevic is a nationalist, and certainly the Bosnian the Republic of Srpska, which is a very nationalist enclave. To the right, they said these are all old communists from Yugoslavia. And that's how they get both sides to work together to destroy a regime-hated place. So that's what I mean by the word myth. This is the background information people supporting the regime have to use to justify these crimes. If you mention audits to somebody, they're going to say, well, I don't know who you are. I don't know if you know any. They'll use any rhetorical device possible to avoid talking about it. It's not an issue. It's a meta issue. Srebrenica is this sacred aspect of this duty to protect. We've gone through the ridiculous, non-legal way these things have been promulgated. The fact that these weren't trials by any sense of the term. These guys are sitting in prison for being good soldiers. You could be next. That's the key here. All the interventions that we have condemned for the sake of capitalism, for the sake of liberal ideology, all derive from this myth. That's why talking about it is so difficult. That's why bringing out all these issues, there's no way to argue against what I've said here. No way. This is simply how, it's in black and white. Audits alone is enough to show that the Serbs were absolutely righteous to smash in there and to disarm and do what they can to those who have been fingered as war criminals in the Muslim side. But the fact that this was led and overseen by the U.S. Army, who was involved in this, was involved in the wiping out of Serb areas, nothing will ever happen. And the old Republican wall veteran types will never accept the fact that the U.S. not only accepts this and lauds it, but finances it and led it. That's the key here. The concept of ethnic cleansing was created by Rudolf Finn, was created by the New York Times, was created by the elite media as a way to condemn Serbia and hence justify American intervention and now the full destruction of what used to be a relatively healthy Yugoslav economy. Yugoslavia was not a Marxist state. It held to, you had ethnic particularity and you had the worker control system, which I've spoken about and voiced. I probably should do this again. I oversaw a dissertation. I was the chairman of a dissertation on this very subject. The notion of the worker control boards and worker councils that were that functioned under Tito in Yugoslavia. And it was the U.S. who used the Croatian violence to try to destroy it. So it went from what was approaching a first world economy to now reduced back to the third world, because that's what the U.S. requires. And this has been the pattern everywhere they've gone, and this so-called massacre, the Srebrenica, has been at the center of it all. This is the myth. This is the background, the meta-historical thinking, the story that everyone who accepts this kind of thing has to believe. Anyone in uniform has to believe, unless you suffer with cognitive dissonance. This is the nature of our postmodern foreign policy. And as always, every iota of it is a lie. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I will talk to you next time. Bye-bye.